Certainly, the intelligence community is using the UFO and using the phenomena to hide whatever it's hiding. That's part of the literature that this flying saucer and the soul are related. We see that over and over again in the history of religions, and for some reason, our cultural mythos wants them to be threats. It's actually much more complicated than that.
I have been very disappointed with what's going on in the UAP world. And if I have to give you a word, I would give you the word misinformation. So right now, as far as the nuts and bolts part of the thing is concerned, I don't know what to think. But the high strangeness part, that is real, right?
And he assumed at first, as you were saying, that it was this nuts and bolts phenomenon, that beings that were landing in the garden or whatever and sneaking into the bedroom and plucking them from their beds. Actually, it started to look like something very, very different. These experiences, as he called them, seemed to be entering some kind of alternate state of consciousness.
Oh, I hadn't paid much attention to the UAP thing until there was the congressional hearing in which people under oath said, I have been part of this. I've seen the technology. It's very, very clear from the work that I've been doing independently that this kind of technology is easily possible from this framework. Switch frameworks. Space-time is just a VR headset. Yeah. And consciousness is the creator of this headset. And we can start to describe a layer of software outside the headset.
What is going on, my friends? And I mean that not just as a mundane turn of phrase, but in the most philosophically gargantuan sense possible. With respect particularly to the UFO topic, the phenomenon, and I would say its relationship to consciousness. And at this point, I have had many a mind meld on these topics. I've explored many nooks and crannies, sometimes crannies where I'm just like, how did I get here? And that's part of the point. I don't often stop and check in and give nuance, give my own opinion, and worry not. I'm not going to sit here and talk at you and do that today. But what I do want to do is share some conversations that I really do deeply value on these topics. Conversations with luminaries that are at the absolute bleeding edge of their respective fields. Cognitive scientist and idealist philosopher Dr. Donald Hoffman, scholar of high strangeness and spirituality Dr. Jeff Kripal, idealist philosopher and author Bernardo Kastrup, and neuroscientist and altered state aficionado Dr. Andrew Gallimore. Links to the full transmissions with each of these geniuses are down in the comments. Much love to all of you, and let us commence. I mean, I absolutely have to bring up the UFO UAP phenomenon to you because you just have such interesting, unique things to say about it. And one of the interesting, unique things that you said, I think this was in another podcast, I don't recall for sure, is you were actually drawing comparisons between the subtle body or out-of-body experiences or soul flight experiences and the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, that's part of the literature that this flying saucer and the soul are related. I mean, we see that over and over again in the history of religions, and that's something that gets elided or not talked about today because for some reason, our cultural mythos wants them to be threats and wants it to be about national security, but it's actually much more complicated than that, and it definitely involves the world of the dead and the soul. If you scratch the surface and kind of get into it in a broader cultural or historical way.
Let's scratch the surface. Let's perhaps go even deeper than scratching. I don't know for sure what it is that captures people's curiosity so much about that phenomenon, but I think that it's I think it's a few different things. I think there's the sort of dark appeal that, look, we really have evidence of this malevolent, threatening other. It's not just made up. It's really out there. But then it's also a path to just the opposite, like a pronoic kind of, oh, they're here to save us. It's angels. It's higher life forms. It's I don't know, Pleiadians or whatever. But whatever it is, it's something. Like, I think we're past the point where I think we can just dispose with the idea that these things can be easily dismissed as, things that crazy people think they saw or whatever. We're far beyond that at this point. But still, there are so many questions. And I wonder how you parse all of that, because I'm very interested and open to what you just said. Yet you also have the Lou Elizondos of the world, who just published a new book, who is going down this road of it is a national security threat. There are hard things out there flying around, crashing, that we've recovered. Like, how do you balance all of that personally?
So I don't. First of all, Lou's book is complex. If you read the first page, he talks about the title imminent and how, that can be followed by the word threat, but it also can be followed by some kind of eschaton or some kind of theological meaning or some kind of transformation of our worldview. So I don't read Lou as just saying one thing. I think he himself questions that physicalist or national security paradigm. I think the UFO is so popular and so in the news because it's so empirical. I mean, you can get the thing on radar. You can study landing tracks. You can, it has a very physical presence. And I think because we live in an age of science and technology, we equate physical with real. Okay. But it also has these paranormal aspects, and people who dig very far into the research realize this very quickly. But that doesn't make it into the media, Michael, because it just messes up the threat, the security and science paradigm. It just throws it into disarray immediately. But I want it to be thrown into disarray. I think it should be thrown into disarray. I think it's really confusing, and it's the way I put it is, a human being is essentially a splitter of reality. We perceive the external world as a set of objects, and we perceive ourselves as some kind of interior subject. So we have a subjective and an objective dimension by our very nature. And that is fundamentally wrong. That is not what reality is. And the UFO is fundamentally objective, but it's also fundamentally subjective. So it violates this cognitive and sensory system that we are in ways I find very familiar, but also very helpful and useful. So I happen to love the topic. And the way I balance those two paradigms is I say, well, that's us. That's the human being who's splitting this into an empirical, physical, objective reality and a subjective, interior, unreal reality. That's the human being. That's not what's actually going on. So that's what I do with it. And somebody like Lou Elizondo, I love Lou Elizondo. These are good people. These retired military professionals and these science, they're good people. They're using their skill set to understand what they can understand. And I'm trying to use my skill set to understand what I can understand. And it's not theirs, And it's not that I think they're wrong. And it's that I think that what they're saying is inadequate. That's part of the puzzle.
How much space do you reserve for the PSYOP hypothesis?
Well, certainly the intelligence community is using the UFO and using the phenomena to hide whatever it's hiding. I can't speak to that because I don't have any classified knowledge, Michael. And if that's what you mean by psyops, I just don't know. And so I try to stay in my lane, and I try to say what I can say historically and comparatively. As you probably know, there are two models of the UFO. One is that it all begins post World War II, late 1940s. But the other model is it's been around as far as we can see back. I'm definitely of the latter camp. And so when people tell me it's all about the CIA or the intelligence, I'm like, well, what do you do with all these where there was no CIA or there was no, I mean, what do you do with that? And of course they don't do anything with it. They deny it, or whatever they do. I don't know what they do. So I just think it's obvious that it goes back in human history and is a global phenomenon. And it's not that again, it's not that I think that the religious interpretations are correct, but there's certainly different ways of engaging with the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. For sure, for sure. Yeah, and by psyop, I mean some kind of concerted effort to misdirect or obfuscate or like to what you were saying, like use the phenomenon as a cover for something that they're actually doing or that they actually know or that in a way where they're pretending, because there's still this really weird push and pull, like with Lou Elizondo, for instance. I just saw on YouTube, I didn't watch it, but apparently the Pentagon has made a counter statement saying like some of these claims that he's making are not true. So it's like, what, like, it's like on one hand he seems to have, because I've seen him say, I have permission to say this, I don't have permission to say that, yet there's also the Pentagon, who he apparently had permission from, saying no, it's not true. So is that, it's like who's not being forthright here? Who's the one that's throwing mud on the lens?
What I know from my own institutional experience is there's no they there. There are multiple people involved. I mean, as in thousands, if not
Sure.
10,000.
Yeah.
And and different agencies and different individuals are going to have different motivations and different claims. And so, again, I don't try to parse those out, Michael, because I do not have access to that material. What I have access to is the historical religious material, so I can speak to that. Um, and it far transcends and predates any of this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm like, and one of the things I often say is that the paranormal has always been weaponized. This is not unique to the U.S. If you look at the history of what we might call magic or clairvoyance, it's always been used to hunt and kill animals or to go to war or to, seduce someone else. It's always been used. It's always been weaponized.
Mm.
I think this is behind the fear of psi, frankly. If this is a Stephen Browdy argument, if psi can be used for positive ends, and it can also be used for negative ends.
Yeah.
And so there's this natural human fear of it that I think is well grounded, but also kind of naive because people have these abilities. Sorry, they just do. You can moralize it all you want, but it's still the case. So that's kind of my response to it.
Was there a moment or series of moments where you felt like the preponderance of evidence really suggests that these things are real? Because I love that you're just blunt about it. Like, sorry, this is real. I've seen you say, sorry, levitation's real. I like, these other things.
That's what I love about it too. I mean, it's like, sorry, it's the case. And I mean, Lou says this a bit, but somebody like Colin Kelleher or James Lukatsky says it more. Not only is it real, it's entirely physical and it's entirely paranormal. And if you take either of those things off the table, you are not talking about the phenomenon. You're talking about whatever you want to talk about, but you are not dealing with the reality of the situation.
Yeah, yeah.
So when I hear that, I'm like, you go get them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
But in your own case, was there something that flipped you, so to speak?
Oh, that's well. I've talked to tons of people who work on this, and I don't know. I can't locate one place, Michael.
Yeah.
I first dealt with the UFO phenomena with the Estlin book, by the way, because believe it or not, the counterculture is filled with this stuff. And there are novels and conferences, and I mean, it's just everywhere. You cannot talk about the 1970s and 80s without talking about this if you're talking about religious undercurrents. So I first dealt with it then, and it was obvious to me that people were having these experiences. I guess I didn't think about the empirical reality of it, to the same extent I do now.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite stories from, you said you're in that latter camp of really believing that this phenomenon we're seeing today, or at least a subset of this phenomenon we're seeing today, goes back way into history. What are some of your favorite well-attested historical instances of high weirdness?
Well, the ones that are most developed in the literature is the Fatima apparitions of 1917
Hmm.
in Portugal, and Ezekiel, which is what, 5th, 6th century BCE. I mean, and these show up again and again. And if you read, if you read Ezekiel, chapter 1 and 2, I mean, it's so clear. This is a UFO event, in ancient Israel, and I mean, he's even abducted. I mean, it's all there, you know, and it's really weird. But you see the same kinds of motifs: the wheels within wheels, and the abduction, and the visionary, and the cosmic human being. You see all this again in the modern accounts, and so it's 2,500 years.
Yeah.
You know, the Fatima apparitions, if you're not familiar with them, were 6 apparitions that happened on the same day every month for 6 months, starting in May and ending in October. And if you look at those events carefully, there's 3 children, very small young children, who had these apparitions or these visions. They didn't even say it was the Blessed Virgin early on. It was a woman in a ball of light landing on a tree. And it was weird. It was super weird. And as the months go on, it gets disciplined or shaped into a Marian apparition, because that's what Catholics did. Um, but even as a Marian apparition, it's an extremely strange set of events that don't really fit in to the Marian Catholic worldview. And so that's what I mean. That's what I love about this stuff. It kind of fits, but it really doesn't. And when you look at that tension, to me, that makes it more real and more legitimate. And um, I would never say that the Marian apparition is a UFO event, but I also wouldn't say that the modern UFO events are, ancient aliens or ancient astronauts. I wouldn't say that, because these are all interpretations, and they really don't work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
The extraterrestrial hypothesis works for some things, but not other things.
Right. Yeah.
And so I want to, as I keep saying, I want to keep it all on the table and understand these different mythologies that wrap around it. But I also, again, I don't believe the particular mythologies or the particular belief systems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the thing that is just so, I don't know, vexing to me is that, you read something like Jung's take on it, that it's sort of this emerging.
Well, he didn't know what it was.
Right.
It's completely puzzled, right?
Yes, right. Yeah, he like an emerging mythology. And in a lot of ways, he was saying exactly what we're saying, right? It is something. I'm not saying it's a projection. Ontologically speaking, it's something, but we're projecting an emerging mythology onto this thing collectively.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I'm like, that is it. But at the same time, you hear the Lou Elizondo stories about stuff in hangars or whatever version of that, and it complicates things in a way that
So if they haul the bodies out and the craft, I think I'll change my tune.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, come on. But the point is that they have not. And we always hear about people who heard, or people that saw something have told someone else this. And I know, as a historical researcher, the number one rule is I have to cite my sources.
Right.
And you, Michael, have to be able to go to the same sources that I'm citing. And if you can't, I can't. Why would you believe me?
Right.
And so, I think what someone like Lou Elizondo is doing, or these retired military people are doing, is entirely legitimate, and they're just telling us the truth. that they can't cite their sources for various classified reasons. But as a historian of religions, I'm very familiar with that. I'm very familiar with that need of secrecy or esotericism, and I'm very suspicious of it. But I think so are they. At the end of the day, is what I'm trying to say. I don't. Again, I've sat with these people. I've talked to them. They're good people. I'm not questioning their integrity or their honesty in the least. Um, I just think it's more complicated.
Yeah.
It's way more complicated than that.
Last question on this bit, but I'm always curious to see how people who have thought deeply about this topic think about this question. What is your sense on why now? Why now, after so much demonization, have all of these people who are extensions of the government, though they have severed their direct ties or whatever? Why are they being allowed to say this now?
I think again, I belong to big institutions. You can't keep a secret long. You can keep it for a while. You can keep it for a few decades, but you can't permanently keep secrets like this. And my other thing, why now? I get asked this a lot, by the way. I actually don't think the phenomena has increased or decreased. I think the cultural uptake has increased or decreased. So I think these experiences happen as much in the Amazonian basin as they do in New Mexico. But what gets reported and what gets picked up in the culture is very different than what actually happens. And I'll give you an example. Take the near death experience. And by the way, the other answer to your question is technology.
Yeah.
Okay. And the near death experience is a really good example. So I think human beings have been having near death experiences for as far as we can see back. But guess what? They died,
Right.
and they didn't come back and tell their story after the development of biomedical technology got to a certain point, say in about 1960 or 70, people could go pretty far into the death process and we could pull them back. And guess what they did? They told stories of what they were seeing and experiencing. And enough of those stories collected, and it became the near-death experience in 1975 because of a book, by the way. And so I think it's publication, it's technology, it's the culture's ready for this, but the culture is not ready for it. What most people don't know about the near-death literature is that it was heavily rejected by fundamentalist Christians. And the reason is nobody goes to hell.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And this flying saucer or UFO thing is also a big problem theologically. And so the question I get asked a lot is, or I actually invoke it, I don't even get asked, is, do you baptize an alien? And my answer is no. And there's two reasons. One is, first of all, it won't let you. But the second reason is, do not reduce the phenomena to your own worldview. Do not do that. And baptism is a great way of just saying, oh, you're a creature of God. Jesus died for you. Let's baptize you into my worldview. Let's make you a good whatever, I'm like, no, that is actually not what's going on here. This phenomena is here to challenge your worldview, not to have you return to it.
That sounds like the beginning of a good satirical piece of sci-fi where there's like two aliens that get baptized into competing religions that hate one another, and then now it's just as bad as it was before, except we have super powerful aliens who both equally believe that they're saved under the umbrella of some. Yeah, that's a funny idea. Friends, I have been cooking up the goods over in the members section on YouTube and at patreon.com/third eye drops. What are said goods, and was cooking really the best verb you could summon on this occasion? Well, to the former question, said goods are weekly at least roughly, exclusive content that you are never going to see here on the main feed, with some of your favorite guests, by the way. Case in point, I am slowly working on a doc that I shot at Contact in the Desert this year with a number of your favorite beings on the topic of UFOs and consciousness, and I will be releasing the full unedited conversations with all of those people only on the members channel and on Patreon. If you do join up over at patreon.com/third eye drops, you will get access to all of those exclusive videos, plus a patron only Discord and occasional live hangs and more. And yes, of course, the doc will be coming out on the main feed if I didn't make that clear. So much love for watching, my friends. While I have you, tickle that algorithm, like, subscribe, review if you are listening on Spotify. And one of the things, I think you call this out pretty specifically in a way that was a little bit of an epiphany for me personally, that I'd never quite thought about it, is that it almost seems like whatever is responsible for putting the image in front of the experiencer is like a thing in and of itself. Like that there's this almost this unseen symbolic software that places familiar images in front of the experiencer's, I don't know what you call it, mind's eye. And that is such a fascinating idea, that there could be this almost like daimonic symbol keeper or something that's showing just the thing to make sense to the experiencer as they're experiencing it. And that's an idea that's like, I don't know, it's like the software underneath the software, but above the hardware, or something. I don't know what. How do you think about that idea with more sophisticated language than what I just used?
Fine. You invoke Neoplatonism. I mean, come on.
Oh yeah, let's go there.
Yeah, I mean, so I was just a kid who grew up in Nebraska. I grew up in a small town, and I got to the seminary and I started to learn about what they were calling the unconscious. And that blew my mind. It just blew up everything, because what it implied was that human beings are driven by forces of which they are not aware. And that was obviously the case with male sexual orientation and religious vocation and ecstatic religious experience. And that's why I pursued that for so many years. When you get to what they call the phenomenon today, it's obviously deceptive. It's not what is there, but people hear the word deceptive and they immediately go to sinister. And I'm like, no, that's not true, actually. Deception is a sign of intelligence. It's not a sign of ill intent. It can have ill intent, but deception is used in biology to reproduce, to hide from predators, to prey on other things. I mean, deception is used for all kinds of reasons in the natural world, and I suspect it's being used here as well. And I also, I work with religious phenomena, and I don't believe these things, Michael. I don't believe that what's appearing is what's really there, but I believe that that's what's appearing.
Yeah.
And so there's just kind of this paradox where you're taking the appearances seriously, but you're not essentially buying into the the appearances. And I think that's what's going on. And I think if you look at paranormal phenomena or the UFO today, you're just going to run into this deception all the time. And the knee-jerk reaction is to think that it's all human-based. It's just people, screwing with other people and creating fraud or disinformation or whatever they're doing. And that, of course, happens. But there's something deeper going on, that the phenomena itself is, and it may not be deceiving us in the intentional way, but I think it's speaking to us in the only way it can. I don't think
Yeah.
it can speak rationally or cognitively, because that's not what it is. It's something, some form of consciousness or awareness that is so beyond any kind of cognition or sensory capacity that, how is it going to talk? How is the fisherman going to talk to the fish?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, how is the phenomena going to talk to us? And of course, it speaks in symbols and speaks in myths and narratives. And so I just think that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. And so let's do that. Let's use methods and theories that acknowledge this narrative kind of approach to things and aren't always looking for, material mechanisms.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and I think I just want to clarify and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is my understanding of your position. You were saying that you don't believe in these experiences, but from my understanding of your stance, it's that you don't believe the images. You
I
believe
don't believe
the
the
ontological. Oops, go
Yeah,
ahead.
the content
Yeah,
is what I'm not signing my name to. It's like, I'll give you a really simple example
sure.
that I talked about before. So near-death experiencers will often talk to me and they'll tell me what they saw in the afterlife and what heaven's like and all this. And uh, I can't believe any one of those stories, because if I believe that story, I can't believe all these other stories. I have to dismiss all these other human beings. So for me, the argument from compassion and from a kind of capaciousness is to acknowledge what this person saw or believes, but not myself believe those beliefs.
Yeah.
I believe the experience, but I don't believe the beliefs, if I can put it that way. And so I'm not dismissive. I'm not the skeptic. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm also not the believer.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And one of the things I can't help but think of when we're talking about this invisible piece of software, or to use my term, daimon, that serves you up just the right image so that you can interact with it and understand it, is the Hermes archetype. Like,
Yeah.
I know there's a passage, and at some point I captured the whole thing because it was just one of the most mind-blowing fucking passages that you even amongst Jung's other mind-blowing passages, he talks about the Hermes archetype, or I think he calls it the Mercurius or whatever, in Psychology and Alchemy. And he talks about the multiplicity of ways that this archetype presents itself, like this like multi-faced. You use the word deceptive, and that's another word that you could ascribe to this archetype, right? And I mean, he goes down this list of, it's God, it's the devil, it's the redeeming psychopomp, it's the wise old man Senex archetype. It's, and he does it in a way where it doesn't just seem like it's arbitrary and he's using a convenient uh mythopoetic hermeneutical device there and just lumping it all under Hermes. Like, it makes so much sense. And then if you just think about throughout the ages, the way that God or archetype was talked about is like the closest to man. He's the friendliest to man. He's the guide. He's the keeper of boundaries. It sounds exactly like whatever this nebulous thing that would serve you up just the right piece of imagery is. I would love to talk more about near death experiences, because that's something you have so much experience with, and this underlying, the difference of the particular images, yet the consistency of the underlying grammar. It seems to be just a really good example of this thing that we're talking about in general. How there is this, this out of body thing that happens, and then this sort of ascent motif that happens, and then meetings with various figures that happen, and then you seem to hit this point where you almost go into this non-dual unitive type of place, but then you're told, nope, you're not allowed to go here yet, and then back in you go. um I think that might be one of the best examples of this whole thing.
I was at Harvard in May for a conference on Platonism, and there were all these Platonists there, and they were talking about the daimon, the daimon this and the daimon that. And it was so refreshing to me, because the daimon's not the demon.
Right.
And as a historian of religions, someone who compares religious systems, I'm just so aware of that. And frankly, the daimon in a Neoplatonic sense is way more helpful to explain what's going on in the UFO phenomenon than the Christian
Oh
demon.
yeah.
I mean, the Christian demon is frankly silly and not helpful at all. And it's exactly what gets invoked over and over again. And there's a part of me that acknowledges that these are demonic in the sense that they question the relevancy of the worldview that's at stake, but they're not demonic in the sinister or evil sense. And um, that's where I just have a huge problem with this. So I think the daimon is, but it's not that I want to sign my name to the daimon either. It's not that the Neoplatonists had it all right, and now all we have to do is become Neoplatonists and we'll be fine. That is not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say, look, there are different moments in human history, and they have their different interpretations of this, and we need to take it all in, but we need to come up with our own reading of it. And I think this is what Jung was doing, by the way.
Yes.
He was definitely not a Neoplatonist, but he definitely wasn't a good Lutheran either. He was trying to lift off the game board, as it were, and figure out what the whole game is. He was trying to figure out that software or hardware behind the display. And I like Jung. I mean, I've spent my whole life lecturing in Jung centers and talking to Jungians, and I've read tons and tons of Jung. I think he was great for the time. I think we just know a lot more now, and we have to think different thoughts and say different things. And it's not that we're better; it's just that we're at a different place.
I do the third thing, and we've gotten kind of far away from it now, but there were more questions I had, and plus this is fertile territory for another subject that you and I are fascinated by. Returning to that subject of what are we capable of with our consciousness in terms of reaching out, and what is it possible to reach out to and communicate with via that latent capability that we seem to have. So, wrapped up in this is there's still questions about like what is within that disassociated boundary and what is outside of it, or what is a product of your own personal psyche versus the collective. But how do you view things like, for instance, like a DMT entity or something that appears to be autonomous, whole ecosystems that appear to be like freestanding, hyperdimensional, very, very unlike our everyday reality? Do you take seriously the idea that these really could be freestanding, predominantly like mental ecosystems? Or do you think this is probably within the dissociated boundary of the individual psyche?
I think it is conceivable that there are freestanding mental realms that we don't pick out under no ordinary circumstances because they don't have a bearing on our ability to survive and reproduce. So we didn't evolve cognitively to pick out those realms in mental space. So to say it's useless for us, it would only cognitively overload us. So it is conceivable that there are mental ecosystems beyond our dissociative boundaries where there are semi-autonomous or maybe autonomous complexes, mental complexes, also partly dissociated themselves, and where they live out their experience. That is conceivable. I would be very cautious, though, of any psychonaut coming back and saying,
right,
making that affirmation as a fact. I think for us to be able to say that, we would need to have, a study under controlled conditions, many volunteers, a lot of prior training, which would be required for anybody to even have a hope to steer their psychedelic experience in a given direction, which for me was impossible. I never managed to do that when I used psychedelics until several years ago. I did that for a period of 2 years as a kind of research exercise. I never could steer it. It chose what I would experience, never the other way around. So if it is to be possible at all to make a evidence-based inference that there are such realms, we would have to find ways to steer psychedelic trips, which right now we haven't. So I would be very cautious against these claims for the time being, even though I think it is conceivable. There is nothing a priori impossible about it under analytic idealism.
Yeah. Talk about stretching your metacognitive horizon. That's a big stretch. That's like some advanced yoga for sure. Trying to bring back anything approaching coherent that is so alien to the way that you typically view reality and associate with reality, yet you're just left with this indelible, just lifelong imprint that the mystery is real. It's out there. You can experience it. It absolutely can overwhelm you. And beyond that, I agree. You have to use a lot of caution as to what it is, what it isn't, what it wants, what it really consists of, how it presents itself even. And to put more resolution in what I was saying that I was talking about with Jeff Kripal is, he, as you know, is deeply obsessed with all of the frontiers of consciousness and takes them very seriously. But he also, like you and like me, is very cautious about placing too much weight on the image as it's presented or remembered by the experiencer, because that image, like, we don't even understand what it is. We understand it can be colored by psychology, by culture, by uh whatever bias and predispositions that we have. And that leads to all kinds of really interesting questions as to, like, why that image? What is presenting the image? Why does it show up in that way? Is that an artifact of some part of your own dissociative boundary? Is that a mask it consciously chose to present in? Like, there's so many interesting questions, again, when you get to these frontiers of consciousness that
Yeah, I think psychedelic gnosis, when it's brought back as literal, is very suspicious. Yeah. The mind manifests itself psychedelic, and the mind
right.
manifesting.
Yeah.
It manifests itself symbolically. At the same time, I mean, I think most of the figures that appear in our reveries are part of our own collective, our own mind talking to itself. And we have internal dissociations as well. We are not a unity. Any therapist with a lot of clinical experience will tell you that we are collectives, and there's still a child in us, there's still a teenager in us, there are still those Bernardos who have been repressed and not heard, not listened to, and they're still there. They all still have their feelings, they all still have their emotions. So maybe some of that appears as entities, but they are not really objective entities outside us. But there are realms in psychedelic space where the agencies that seem to appear are so alien,
Yeah.
and yet so agential. They seem really have their own
Right.
agency,
Yeah.
and they seem to find us just as strange as we find them. And
Totally.
so I wouldn't poo-poo that entirely.
No.
Sometimes you come back with an experience that you think, whoa, it's like you just happened into a place where you were not expected, and everybody who was there looks at you funny, like, what the hell? Who the hell are you?
Yeah.
What are you doing here? And the alienness is so profound. It's not only at the seemingly physical level, but also at the level of logic and emotion. The alienness is so profound that I can understand that some people find it hard to think that it is a part of themselves, because it's profoundly non-human, profoundly non-anything that we can speak of in language. And I've been maybe once or twice, very few times, to space in the psychedelic realm in which I had this feeling that, wow, this is really something now. And it was very different from all my personal shit, because usually you confront your personal shit in a psychedelic trip, everything you repressed, all of your your dark side that you don't want to acknowledge, your hidden desires, your depravity and your guilt and your anxiety and all that stuff. But so you get used to that. You get used to identifying your own shit after a while. But then occasionally, very rarely, you happen upon a space that is totally different. And then you go like, whoa, what is this now? This is something.
Yeah, so I assume you're aware of the extended state DMT experiments that are being done at Imperial College London now. And I have one of my friends, actually, Alexander Biner, was a participant in that pilot study. And I mean, this is a guy with a lot of experience in altered states, but very considerable philosophical grounding. Were you ever on the channel Rebel Wisdom?
Yes, I've talked to him once or
Yeah.
twice, I
Okay.
think.
So you know him. Yeah. And I mean, he is pretty convinced after being, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but after a few, many conversations with him and a few of them recorded, it's pretty difficult for him to swallow that it's not like that you're not entering a freestanding ecosystem. I mean, just like you said, it's almost like, and the way he talks about it, it's like going into a rainforest or something. Some stuff is interested in you and wants to run around you and be like, hey, look at this. Some stuff doesn't give a shit. Some stuff is not particularly friendly, but it's feels incredibly vast and teeming with life. And he told me that they've now either done a study or are going to do a study that's aimed at what we're talking about, trying to put multiple people in the state at the same time and see if there's agreeance or replicability on what's being seen when. And I'm just so eager to hear the results of that because there's just so many anecdotal cases of people being in psychedelic states together, having what seems like some kind of boundary breaking mental connection.
Yeah, for me, this happened really maybe twice, probably only once. Most of my psychedelic journeys were either about the hidden parts of me
Mm-hmm.
or about the whole. So
Yeah.
not any particular ecosystem, but the whole, the cosmic itch that drives the endogenous excitations of mind at large, the unasked questions that drive the universe forward. There is only one consistent entity, if you will, or agency. I prefer the word agency that I have encountered many times, and I can't tell you whether it's me or not. But it was always an agency that I'll describe it symbolically now. That always was very interested in giving me a gift, and that gift was not a thing; was a way of seeing, was a realization. And it's very difficult to get a human to
Wow.
achieve that realization because of how our cognitive system is wired and what it's optimized for, what it has evolved to do. So you sort of have to unwind all that stuff. You have to undo all of those clampings, all of those foldings that we have evolved to have in order to be able to see the gift. And I succeed. And this agency was always trying to help me do that. And to do that, you have to undergo a benign form of deception, because what prevents you from seeing it is yourself. Your patterns of thinking and feeling prevent you from seeing that. So you have to be unwound. And this thing is trying to deceive you into unwinding yourself. It's a benign form of deception. Wow. And once that happens, then you see the thing, and it starts as a spherical object with glowing lights. But if you can actually see it, then it's not an object. It's thought, it's emotion, it's you and other, it's self and world, it's the panacea, it's the template, the pattern underlying everything. It is everything.
This sounds
in that
very
sphere.
This sounds very Hermes-like the thing
It is a beyond orgasmic experience. So throughout most of my trips, I always sensed the presence of this agency, and in a few, I could see it. I could see the thing.
Wow.
And it is mind blowing. It's a level of delight and clarity that is unfathomable. You cannot bring that back. It's an experience of the moment, and it belongs in that realm, and in that realm alone. You don't get to bring it back. The only thing you bring it back is profound gratitude that such a thing exists in nature. Even if you say it's a form of illusion, fine. Under idealism, everything is mental. So there is a sense in which you could say everything is an illusion. But if it is so, it's as real as an illusion, as real an illusion as this right now, because it's experienced as real. And at the end of the day, that's all. That's all we have, right? There's no reality outside mind. So to me, it has been comforting many times to come back and know that such a thing, whatever it is, exists in nature. It's very reassuring and it's delightful. It's a form of art beyond anything conceivable.
That's incredible. And I mean, from like Jung would have a field day with this. I mean, a vision of this like spherical agency that feels like this boundary transcending completion. It sounds very soul-like or daimon-like, or like I said, Hermes-like, this thing that sort of transcends boundaries that are normally not able to be transcended. But it's like beyond whatever that personal dissociative boundary is, but it's also within it at the same time. And you normally do not have the ability to wrap your mind around that in any way, or even witness it in any way. But under the right circumstances, it's possible to have a sort of like absolutely mercurial encounter with this thing.
Yeah, it is. It is not a product of me. It's not a product of Bernardo Kastrup. Now, whether it's outside my dissociative boundary or immanent in it, I would tend to say it exists in a form in which this distinction does not hold. We cannot think of reality in these spatial terms anymore at the level of that gift, that thing. It's a kind of it's a singularity. It's a self-recursive singularity. It's like a key to existence, the key to all complexity. It is that out of which everything unfolds. It's the folded form of all of existence, the folded form with the inherent templates, the inherent dispositions of existence that generate everything if you allow it to unfold. So it's a self-recursive singularity that creates everything out of itself. And at that level, because it's a singularity, it makes no sense to say, is it inside my dissociative boundary?
Right.
Or is it outside? Is it immanent in everything? Or is it geographically located in mental space? All of this stuff collapses. So that's why I never wrote about it. It's impossible to write about it.
Yeah, it's like an encounter with nous or logos or anything that is just so beyond language that any language you try to foist onto it is actually sort of damaging the purity of whatever you experienced. Yeah, those experiences are just so valuable that it is.
It's not something to bring back from a psychedelic trip. I mean, if you did psychedelics like I did as a research enterprise, I find it preposterous to do psychedelics for fun. They're not fun. They're very hard.
Yeah.
So you do it as a kind of, study. So there is a lot in my trips that I had this sense, this is fish I can bring back to the tribe, like McKenna used to say, stuff that you can bring back. But the gift was never that. It doesn't have that ethos of being part of your curriculum. It's grace. Every now and then you're granted grace for the sake of it. It doesn't have the higher purpose of you writing about it or how it's going to change your life. No, it's just grace. That's all.
Right.
There's nothing more to it.
It's a numinous gift.
Yeah.
A numinous gift. Yeah, I love that. Since we talked last, we did riff on this topic in our last conversation, but it was just before you released your article on the UFO UAP topic. So I didn't get to ask you this, but from my memory, you do bring up high weirdness as a unavoidable part of this conversation, and you kind of distinguish it from the nuts and bolts phenomena. But I don't recall if you brought up this sort of idea of mental agencies as potentially being the source of some of this phenomena.
I did.
Did you? Okay.
it's in an older book called Meaning in Absurdity.
Hmm.
I explicitly did just that. So look, I have been very disappointed with what's going on in the UAP world this year. Disappointed to the point of disgust, of just closing certain accounts that were, well, I don't want to talk about it. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I'm disappointed to the point of disgust. So if I were to maintain anything about my views on high strangeness phenomenon, I would say it's the high strangeness part that I think holds water, that I think is doubtless. You cannot just ignore the reports of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and those reports carry the hallmarks of truth. And I'm not going to share publicly what I consider those hallmarks to be. Otherwise, next week every report will have that those hallmarks. But I have my private understanding of what the hallmarks are, and I apply them. For instance, Ibn Alexander has the hallmarks. Anita Mojani has the hallmarks.
Yeah.
Certain people in the UAP and alien abduction, so-called alien abduction discourse, have the hallmarks. A bunch of others don't. So I take high strangeness seriously. Now, the recent nuts and bolts hoopla I did take seriously until last year. Until some point this year, I take less seriously now. There are some, in my mind, very concerning developments, very concerning material, very concerning actions, and it frankly disgusts me. So I checked out from that.
Like, are you? Sorry, just to clarify, are you leaning more toward that feeling, like, for lack of a better term, a psyop, or something that's being co-opted for propaganda purposes, or an agenda beyond the truth, or what is disgusting you specifically?
Well, I wouldn't go religious about it. I don't think it's appropriate, but I question now the motivations behind a lot of what's happening. And if I have to give you a word, I would give you the word misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, as far as the nuts and bolts part of the thing is concerned, I don't know what to think.
Yeah.
And I realized that I cannot know what to think.
Right.
And so I dropped that ball. I don't want to be part of that. I literally closed very special high security accounts that I had, and it shows you to the extent of my concern.
Yeah.
But the high strangeness part, that is real, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up, with the hallmarks, you brought up people who are famous for being near-death experiencers, people who they didn't have a, ET experience per se. They had a dying experience, via which they went through all kinds of archetypal encounters with other, and or with the extra beyond the physical. And I know of cases that are more aligned with a UAP UFO community where people's experiences are closer to that, for sure. And I don't know if you want to get into specific examples of people that you think have gotten a similar message, but it's interesting to me in and of itself that you equated it with near-death experiences. I think that says a lot. And one thing I'm not personally sure about, I obviously haven't had a near-death experience, but one thing that I'm not sure about is what I think about the overlap between my kind of like heroic dose experiences with potentially other agencies or consciousness systems, or whatever you want to call it, and what I think that says about this phenomenon. Like, I would love to have some sort of overarching cohesive narrative that it is all a product of the same, which ultimately, I guess, in idealism, it is a product of the same thing. But the foundation of analytic idealism is that everything is one. There is one consciousness. We are disassociations of that one consciousness. But beyond that, between our disassociation and the fundamental reality, you must entertain the idea that there are many other dissociations or like hierarchies or something, right? Like, and maybe we're just peering into an absolute ocean of disassociations, or what you could call beings, and they're just going to present in all kinds of ways. And that's what the truth beyond our boundary is that there's this panoply of other ways that consciousness presents itself, and that we're beginning to scratch the surface of whatever that is.
I am with the spirit of what you said. I would only not agree with one specific part which you said, which was between us and this world, there must be other levels, a hierarchy of dissociations. I don't know that, because we have a physical appearance, so the rest of this universe. So if there is anything in between, I would expect it too to have a physical appearance, and we don't find it. It's not, at hand. But it is entirely conceivable that this universe is just one segment of mind at large, and it's the segment in which we exist, and then there are parallel universes, not Everettian parallel universes. I think that's bullshit, because the motivation to postulate that is nonsensical. It lacks all empirical grounding. It's a theoretical fantasy. Now, even though Everettian multiverses, I think, is ungrounded and therefore should be discarded, that doesn't mean that all the entire notion of parallel universes in general, not parallel universes that arise because both possibilities of a measurement are actually true in a different parallel universe. No, I'm not talking about exploding gazillions of parallel universes that pop into existence out of nothing every time two quantum systems interact. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about mushrooming parallel physical universes. I'm talking about parallel universes that may exist at all times. We don't have the power to create or destroy them by an observation, and they will not look physical to us because other rules apply, maybe even other rules of logic, because logic is axiomatic, right? So it is conceivable that there are parallel universes of this latter kind, which we have no access to because there is some kind of universal level of dissociation splitting these bubble universes from each other. And it is conceivable that during a very high dose psychedelic trip, it is conceivable, I'm not saying that I have reasons to believe that, but it is conceivable that in a high dose psychedelic trip in which most of the dynamic structure of mind is just dissolved, because that's what psychedelics do, that one could catch a glimpse of what's happening in the next room in the palace of the universal mind, so to say. Because what confines us here are certain cognitive structures. That's the only way you can create structure in a mind, is structures of cognition, structures of association, dissociation, representation and re-representation, and so forth. So if you dismantle those structures that create this universe in which we are rooted, it stands to reason that you go to a level of mentation which is so raw, in which you can catch a glimpse of whatever else is going on in the palace of mind. So that is conceivable, yes. And the telltale sign of that would be that not only is the physics different, but the logic is different. That Aristotelian axioms don't apply. I think Aristotelian, at least 4 of them, apply to this universe. So if I'm having a discussion on analytic philosophy, I will be largely an Aristotelian. I'm actually an intuitionist. Intuitionism accepts 4 of the Aristotelian axioms and rejects one, which is the law of the excluded middle, which says that things are either true or false, not both and not neither. Well, I reject that. I think I see truth as a construct. You have to have an example of it to prove that it exists, as opposed to proving that it cannot be false. That's just abstraction. You see, so
Right.
I'm an intuitionist in this universe, but I'm keenly aware that if we are not talking about this universe, we are not having an analytic discussion, or you're having loser, frontiers discussion,
Right.
then I would say the telltale sign of these other realms in the overall palace of mind would be that also logic does not apply. That the expectations about what makes sense and what doesn't would be very different. In other words, absurd.
Yeah.
My strangeness.
Yeah. Or at the very least, not linear and not subject to the way that things work in everyday consensus reality.
Correct.
And eventually you get to this metaphysical notion of there being something very similar to what you're describing in a more technical way, which is that you have these like gradations of agency and ontological power. And that's like kind of what this word hyparxis means, is you higher things on the chain have more hyparxis, and then there's other things underneath those things that have less and less as it goes down.
Yes.
So it puts us in this constraint that you've been describing as the headset, right? Or that we could think about as being within a game, as within Grand Theft Auto. But then there's like limitations. There's still these limitations as to what we can do. But then the interesting question is are these insights that you're talking about, are these potential ways to increase the scope of what the headset can do? Like, are these ways to expand what a human maybe even can do? Or are we always going to be limited? I mean, we're going to be limited to some degree, of course. Like, I don't think it's possible for us to dissolve back into the one as a human being and like continue to exist. But do you see that as a real possibility, that we're going to unlock new faculties, new modes of perception, things we can't even imagine right now?
Absolutely. And so I'll first start off with a statement that's, to put some modesty on the whole thing. That is, this is just the first layer outside of software outside of space-time. So it's So I'm not claiming anywhere close to a theory of everything or anything like that. But I think with that proviso, I think that there's magic here. Think about it this way: if you are a wizard inside Grand Theft Auto, you can do all sorts of amazing things, and people are impressed. But if you're the geek that wrote the software, you can do things that the wizard doesn't understand. You can make their car disappear. You can take the tires off their car. You can just do magic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if what we're saying is correct, we're going to be unlocking incredible magic. And so I'll just give you one example of the kind of magic that goes on. This time dilation stuff. Suppose I'm able to use this big matrix. That's me. I've got this big matrix. My time counter is going for every one of those experiences. And suppose that your matrix is only 1/10 of mine, right?
So you only see. Probably is, Don, to be honest.
Well, I should have turned it the other way. So I'll turn it around. So you got a big matrix, and Hoffman only sees 1/10 of Michael's. But who knows what it is? But so I'll do it that way. So Hoffman has only 10% of Michael's experiences, and what happens then is, for every click of time that I see, Michael could do 10 times many other things. He could do lots of other things where I think nothing has happened. For Michael, it could be 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, depending on how much bigger your matrix is. You could have 1,000 years to do whatever you want, and for me, it's instantaneous. That means effectively that I'm a sitting duck,
right?
Compared to you. I'm a sitting duck. I mean, you can do whatever you want while I'm just sitting there inert, unable to do anything.
Well, where this gets really trippy is if you ask yourself, what kind of a being would that be? Like, obviously this is a fun example, you and me, but if we really try, this really gives you some insight as to what it might be to be a higher being, like an alien, an angel, whatever word you want to put on it. It might be something like this. And maybe that's why when people have, altered states experiences or numinous experiences, they see these things that just completely stretch their ability to conceive. Like in like going back to biblical examples, angels always be not afraid. Like I know whatever I'm looking like to you, it's looking real crazy, but like try not to freak out, And that's been my experience too with altered states. Is it is absolutely that Umwelt I was talking about, where I can easily make sense of reality. It is shaking, man. It is like trying as hard as it can to maintain homeostasis, and it can't happen. So maybe that's what
Right.
it's like for us in our trace, gaining a very low pixel resolution of like what that adding another integer, adding another possibility to that space might be like. It might be this overwhelming, numinous, mysterium tremendum kind of experience.
Absolutely. And I've only talked about the time. There's also the space, as you were saying. So when you have much more dimensions of space, if you're the bigger trace than mine, I'm just a small trace than you, then my distances are different from yours. I've got a limited set of time. I've got a limited set. You're working in a much bigger space than me, as well as you've got more time. So you can do stuff outside where I can't see. You could do something inside my trace. I see it. So I see an object inside the trace. You've let me see it. And then you then do something so that all of a sudden it looks like the thing that I see in my trace moved at Mach 40.
Right.
Accelerated at impossible or faster than the speed of light. But inside your big matrix, you're all within your own laws, quote unquote, laws of physics in your matrix. But because I'm at a much smaller matrix, it looks like magic to me, and it looks like it's impossible to me. So literally, you could be doing all sorts of stuff, and I'm a sitting duck. So there's going to be the technologies that would come out of this are you can't think big enough.
Yeah.
And right. Yeah.
Well, what you just described, I don't know if you want to go here, but what you just described really sounds like most people's UFO experiences when they see one or they try to sense one, is these things are doing things that from our vantage point seem like it shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't be possible to go from sea level to 40,000 feet and then back to sea level again, all within a second or two. But these are supposedly things that fighter pilots have captured on, things that work well enough that we're using them to like protect our country and our interests and fight wars, and those instruments work well for those purposes. So it seems to be telling us something about something, as impossible as it sounds.
Right.
So maybe that's one of the only explanations.
I hadn't paid much attention to the UAP thing until there was the congressional hearing in which people under oath said, I have been part of this. I've seen the technology. I've seen non-human biologics. And so at that point, then I gave myself permission to think about, okay, there is now some credible testimony here that these things may actually exist. And it's very, very clear from the work that I've been doing independently that this kind of technology is easily possible from this framework. If you take space-time as fundamental, then it's hard to explain this technology. It's just sort of like the laws of physics simply don't allow this stuff. And there's no way that we can see in a space-time framework. Of course, we still haven't really united things that in a deep way. We don't have a theory of everything in certain time inside space-time. The standard model goes so far, but there are things that we might try to do inside, but still it's hard to imagine this kind of magic happening. But if you switch frameworks, space-time is just a VR headset.
Yeah.
And consciousness is the creator of this headset. And we can start to describe a layer of software outside the headset. Then it's a no-brainer that if you are the VR designer, you know how it's designed, then you can do magic inside the headset, as I was describing. So I'm actually, it's almost scary, the technologies that can come out of this. So the trace logic is also quite dangerous. And I think understanding the trace logic and perhaps this notion of agency is opening up a Pandora's box. Because if you think about it, this is a way of thinking about technologies that we simply have never had before.
Right.
We have all of our military systems are designed with physics inside spacetime. We've only used what we know about the inside of the headset. So our best military equipment is because we are like the great player of Grand Theft Auto. We know how to do stuff inside the headset. But as soon as you get outside the headset and start playing with the software itself, the first country to do that is the winner in terms of technology. There's nothing that you could do to stop it. So this is it's actually a Pandora's box that's happening here. So one can only hope that one of the big lessons here is, where did the trace logic come from? Where did this theory of consciousness come from? It comes from the idea that that consciousness is fundamental, and each one of us is simply an avatar expression of a deep unified consciousness. And so what comes out of the trace logic is what spiritual traditions have been saying for a long time. When Jesus said it very, very clearly, you'll love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
The implication being your neighbor is yourself, basically. And that's really the point. The trace logic does say all of us are, in fact, the one consciousness looking at itself through different headsets. So someone who is smart enough to begin to use the trace logic outside of space-time to build technologies, hopefully also is smart enough to understand what this is saying. And that is that the person that you're going to use this technology on is you. That person is
so.
you.
Yeah.
And so be careful how you use this technology, because what you're doing, any harm that you choose to do is harm that you're doing to an avatar of yourself. Ultimately, you aren't your avatar. You transcend. But to the extent that you don't want something to happen to your avatar, you should not want something to happen to the avatar of another person. So I'm hoping that that at the same time that we get a technological boost, that we also get in some sense a moral boost from the same place.
Yeah. I suspect, Don, and it seems like that this is the only way I can square this circle I'm about to describe, is within a lot of that same conversation, one of the direct things you seem to be hearing more and more is that consciousness seems to be core to whatever the UAP technology is. And of course, that's very speculative and hand wavy, but maybe it's something along the lines of, if we do add another possibility to our, Markov matrix, maybe it's not just going to be some new advanced physics technology. Maybe it's going to be something that makes that statement make sense, that there is something about consciousness and physics or about reality that's intertwined in a way that right now doesn't make sense to us. But maybe just by unlocking one more gradation of reality or one new possibility or understanding, suddenly there will be some new noesis. There will be some new understanding of, oh, this is how these pieces fit together. We thought that applied technology like this and my qualia, my conscious experience, are two completely categorically different things, but maybe this is the thing that closes the gap or closes the circle or something like that. And along with that would come all kinds of epiphanies and all kinds of new, hugely ontologically reorienting understandings in terms of what we are. And it wouldn't just be like a conversation. It would be I'm talking about like a knowing, like a new sense or a new thing that of course I can't describe, because it's like how do you describe what you don't know? But it's I don't know. That's the nebulous sense that I get.
Right. Well, first, I completely agree, and in the following sense, that what this approach is saying is that what is beyond space-time is entirely consciousness. It is entirely, in some sense, psychological in the way that you were talking about. So yeah, to the extent that the UAPs have been associated with all sorts of psychological phenomena, that also follows immediately from the ontology of this whole approach of the trace logic. It's consciousness all the way down. And so, in fact, all the technologies that look physical, everything that looks to us physical is ultimately, from this point of view, psychological. The very space-time itself is entirely a psychological construct. Everything inside space-time is a psychological construct. Once you understand that, then that opens up the technologies that would seem impossible in a physicalist ontology. And I don't think that we can think big enough outside of the box, but I see no reason why we will be limited to the technologies that we have right now are going to seem pre-industrial compared to what we're going to have, and it will be. By the way, also other experiences, like people on various drug experiences like DMT and so forth. There are some cases they seem to be having experiences that are perhaps in higher dimensional spaces, not just 3 dimensions, right? They might be seeing hyperdimensional objects and so forth. And if Einstein's spacetime, his curved spacetime, is the fundamental nature of reality, then clearly seeing into a 30-dimensional space is only a psychological hallucination. It's not the truth. If our ontology is that maybe a string theory, there's 11-dimensional thing or something like that. But right now, string theory is not. It seems to be on the ropes among the physicists themselves. It doesn't seem to be working. And it's giving us a lot of beautiful insights mathematically and beautiful insights physically, but as a fundamental theory of everything, I don't see physicists rallying around it like they used to. So when you have experiences in really high dimensional spaces now it's quite possible, of course, that any particular experience is just a hallucination. You're just screwing up the brain, and if you hit me on the head, I'm going to see all sorts of stuff. But it's also possible in the framework I'm working on that could be a genuine insight. That maybe if we take some drug, I'm perfectly open to saying that some drugs just screw your brain up, and it's hallucination, and there's no insight into a deeper reality. Period.
Yeah.
But I think that it's certainly possible, and I'm not going to claim right now any specific drug is doing this, but I'd say it is at least in principle possible in the framework I'm working on to have a drug molecule that is already in the brain, for example, and we're tweaking it.
Right.
And that's tweaking a dimension parameter. Right now, the dimension parameter for space is d equals 3. So d, the parameter d has the value 3 in our headset. And we tweak this chemical, now it goes to 5 or 10. And all of a sudden, we have the same kind of architecture, but this one parameter in how we build the headset gets manipulated. So it could be that some simple chemical manipulation in the brain could switch from 3 to 10, because when I'm actually looking at how am I going to actually build space-time from Markov matrices? So when we do these theorems, so we're trying to prove this theorem, right, of how do we get Minkowski space from the theory of conscious agents? What are we doing? It's not just a theorem. This is the first step in building the headset. That's just a headset projection of the software outside of space-time, which is far more complicated. So the big problem of neuroscience hasn't even been started yet.
And it's crazy because it seems like every dimension, no matter how deep we look or how wide we look, within this headset, it's like hinting at that structure over and over again. Like, I'm sure you've seen these, cliche images at this point of how these big galactic superclusters look very brain-like. And to my understanding, they've done some deeper, even like peer-reviewed analysis of the similarities in architecture between, galactic filaments and galaxies, and how similar they look to the brain structure in not like a hand-wavy, yeah, that looks similar way, but a very precise way. And it's the same thing when you look down into the dirt, right? The mycelial mat at the very root level of the planet looks the same. So it seems like at every level of intelligence, at least within the headset, within space-time, is showing us this fractal, layered, intelligent structure at every level. And the question is what does that tell us about, well, there's many questions, but one of the questions is, what does that tell us about the level of intelligence above this one?
Yeah, my understanding from the trace logic now is our headset is one of the cheaper ones, one of the more trivial ones. We have, and this is a really important point, and it's one that's hard to come to grips with emotionally. It's very easy for us to think that we're sort of at the top of the intelligence chain. I look down and I see, an ant crawling around on the ground, and the ant can't see what I'm doing. It doesn't know much about me. I live in a whole world that the ant could never conceive, I would think. And so it probably knows very, very little about my world, and my world is far, I would guess, far superior and far richer than that of the ant. But now, if you think about that, how much do I know about the ant? I don't know that much about the ant. Well, I can do some studies on it, but it's quite possible that my headset, put it this way, I know that I'm very much very rich in my experience and my complexity. And my guess is that the ant's headset isn't telling it very much about me, right? I'm guessing that the ant's headset just doesn't grok Hoffman at all. But given that logic, there's a chance that my headset isn't grokking what I'm interacting with when I see it. All I see is an ant. Maybe all the ant sees of Hoffman is an ant. And it's not because Hoffman is just an ant, it's just because the ant headset can't see Hoffman very well. Well, turnabout is fair play. Maybe when I see something, and I call it just an ant, I think it's trivial, I could be interacting with an intelligence that if I actually understood it, I would fall before it in terror or amazement or whatever, because this thing completely transcends me, but all I can see is an ant. So it's very easy for us to mistake the limits of our headset for an insight into reality. Totally. That's the key point. What you see inside your space-time is entirely a function of the limits of your headset. It is not an insight into the ultimate nature of reality. When I'm seeing a ladybug, that's the limit of my headset. What am I interacting with? If I actually knew what I was interacting with, I might fall down and worship it. But all I can see is a ladybug. So we have to be very, very careful to think of ourselves. The very fact that we think of ourselves as at the top of the food chain shows how benighted we are. To the extent that I feel that I am really smarter than everything I see, that is the key evidence that I know next to nothing. So what this mathematics is telling me is our headset is one of the cheapest headsets that I could imagine in the theory. Wow. It's only got a D parameter of 3. There's no reason why the D parameter couldn't go to 1 billion. Why shouldn't, one thing I'm frustrated, I'm sure many mathematicians are frustrated. I can imagine a 3-dimensional cube. And it's very helpful to imagine things when I'm trying to solve problems. Try to imagine a 4-dimensional cube, a tesseract. I can't do it.
Yeah, me neither.
And and nobody can. Even a brilliant mathematician has to work around this limitation of our imagination. They have to use mathematics and tricks to theorem and proof to get to the properties of these higher dimensional objects. Wouldn't it be nice if we had
someone in the comments is going to say, "Yes, I can. I can do." No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Well, I'm not really. Someone probably will.
Yeah, probably so. And I hope that someone can. And maybe on the right psychedelic, perhaps someone can actually go to a 4-dimensional space and really see a tesseract. I would love to get data that for someone like a real mathematician, just saying so we get someone who's a credible mathematician that says, yeah, I saw a tesseract. Now we're talking about something really interesting. So if some psychedelic can do that, if psilocybin can do that or whatever, that would be very, very interesting.
There was just sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to share this, and I'll try to find the graphic for it. There is someone made an animation where there's hidden information that you cannot see unless you're on, I think it might be psilocybin, or it's definitely some tryptamine, where there are basically like these tracers moving, and you can just see the color of the tracers or something. But if you're on whatever particular whatever the alkaloid is, you can actually see that there's like hidden information that reveals itself under that influence. So I do suspect, and to your point earlier, that may be exactly what we're doing with a certain class of substances, that we are actually tweaking and expanding the headset to some degree. And I would love to say that I think it's just a pure flow of more real information, but I also think there's probably interference from your own mind and your own preconceived notions about reality and your own programming and your own fears and thoughts and blah, 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 that's getting all mixed in there. So you are getting more, but you're also turning up the volume on your own psyche and everything all at the same time. And that's sort of been my experience. It's just like more of everything.
Right. And again, I'm a hard-nosed scientist, so I'll say this. Of course, we have to be open all the time to the possibility that the psychedelic drug is simply addling your brain and there's nothing deep to see here. On the other hand, we should be open with rigorous experiments, no hand waves, with credible subjects where we try to explore, is there something beyond just addling the brain? I think the mathematics I'm working on says there's a good possibility that we might be able to find that kind of thing, and if so, we should study it. But it's not enough to have informal descriptions of psychonauts. We have to have more systematic, hard-nosed, rigorous experiments. And if there are claims of interacting with entities beyond space-time, then we need to substantiate those claims with hard-nosed experiments where information is exchanged from one person to the entities to some other person in a way that could not possibly have happened any other way. So I'm very, very hard-nosed about all this stuff. You have to be both. It's a balance. You have to be completely open to all these possibilities that might seem bizarre, and then you have to be completely hard-nosed about testing them. So it's a balance. Completely open, but no BS at all in the experiments, and you have to be your own harshest critics. And so that's one reason why I'm going after this with mathematicians, and it's a matter of theorem proof. Thing about the Big Bang, getting quantum probabilities out of this, just going down systematically the positive, showing how the positive geometries come exactly out of this. So this is all, and if at any point we can't do it, it's game over, right? If we can't get general relativity from the trace logic and this theory of agency that I talked about, if it's not possible, if we can prove we can't do it, then I will have to say that nice try, but this wasn't it. Back to the drawing board. So this is all fun. I'm excited about it, but we've been disappointed many times before. So we will see. It's got to be theorem proof, not.
Yeah.
But you do have to be willing to think big, think out of the box. It's hard to think out of space-time, and to be rigorous at the same time. And so that's the tightrope that you have to walk.
Yeah, I love it, Don, and I love everything you're doing, and I deeply, deeply appreciate that you are rigorous when it comes to all of this stuff and all the nuance that you put on all of your thoughts. Yet at the same time, you always display this epistemic humility, and yeah, I'm just so glad you're out there. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing.
And someone who seemed to agree with you that I would not have thought of to put in this context that you do put in this context in the book is John Mack. And this is another person who's, just hyper aware of, what a hallucination is, what various neuroses are, and what the way that they portray themselves in the psyche are. And this is a person who was completely unable to accept that people's paranormal experiences, in his case, UFO experiences, were anything but genuine in most cases. And then what's really interesting about him that I actually didn't know, admittedly, is that I didn't know he eventually kind of flips away completely from the nuts and bolts explanation of the UFO phenomenon and gets very interested in psychedelics and shamanism and psi and consciousness. And of course, there's just this giant overlap in the phenomenology of those experiences, UFO abduction experiences, and DMT, as you explore in the book.
Yeah, I mean, Mac was a very important figure, not just in the alien abduction phenomenon, but also in how we think about it. He was a huge problem for those who were kind of wanted to dismiss the abduction experience as a hallucination, because Mac knows all about hallucinations. Mac was the head of the Harvard School of Psychiatry. I mean, this guy wasn't just some little league psychiatrist working in some small village or something. This guy was the top dog, basically. I remember I saw an interview with Mac before he died. Obviously, a stupid thing to say.
I'd be more impressed if it was after.
It wasn't like a channeling. I saw an interview with Mac, and the interviewer said to him, he was quoting Carl Sagan, because everyone likes to bring in Carl Sagan, of course, because he's the epitome of rationality, and whatever he says is the absolute truth. And this guy said to John Mack, well, Carl Sagan says that these abductees, they're just hallucinating. And Mack simply replied, what the fuck does he know about hallucinations? Which is right, because that's true. It's easy for people to just, I'll just pluck this word, hallucinations. I've heard that, kind of understand basically what they are. Well, Mac really understood what hallucinations were and what they looked like. He'd seen countless patients having hallucinations. He knew what was a hallucination and what was seemed to be not a hallucination, when people were lying or when people were dreaming or whatever. And this clearly didn't look like that to him. So he slowly and very gradually and very cautiously began to take their ideas seriously. They weren't insane. They didn't exhibit the symptoms of any serious psychological abnormality. They were perfectly rational, just very, very traumatized people who were having these inexplicable experiences. And he assumed at first, as you were saying, that it was this nuts and bolts phenomenon, that these were beings that were flying into landing in the garden or whatever, and sneaking into the bedroom and plucking them from their beds. But then he realized that actually it started to look like something very, very different. These experiences, as he called them, seemed to be entering some kind of alternate state of consciousness, or being induced into some alternate state of consciousness. And many of his subjects described entering some other kind of world that was kind of parallel to, or just behind, or somehow within, or just outside our world, that had more dimensions than the normal waking world, and that was somehow subsumed. Our normal waking world was in some way subsumed by this other world, which was always there, but we couldn't see. And then, being taken on tours of strange crafts by strange beings, some of which, one of his subjects, which I also quote in the book, which is in his first book, Abduction, describes these small beings that bound around Now that phrase, if anyone's familiar with Terence McKenna, will know about these beings that bound, from the walls or whatever, right? They come bounding in, right? That's so McKenna. And these people were, this is long before, I'm sure, presumably these people, this was in the 80s and stuff. So the experience clearly had many parallels with the kind of experience people have when they smoke DMT, and that they enter this highly technological environment and are greeted by or experimented upon by these incredibly intelligent non-human beings, and then they're brought safely back at the end of it. So Max started to see, and I think it was, started to see that this was what he began to see as more like a spiritual phenomenon in some way, or certainly a metaphysical phenomenon, and that couldn't be explained in its entirety in purely materialist terms. And I think this was kind of cemented when he met this guy called Bernardo, I think his name is Peixoto. I've just done the audiobook, so I should have that pronunciation right. But anyway, he was this shaman guy in the Amazon. I completely forget which country, but anyway.
I just earlier read the name of the tribe, and I'll leave that one to you.
That's a difficult one. What was it called? What were they called? Peixoto. Yeah, that was in the intelligence chapter, right? There we go. Uru Iwawao people. There we go. Bernardo Peixoto, yes, of the in northern Brazil. So I'm not going to read from the book, but this Uru Iwawao people literally means people from the stars.
Right.
And they believe that a long time ago, beings arrived in spaceships and taught their people how to plant corn and do these kind of things, very practical things. And Peixoto's view of these beings was decidedly non-physical. He himself had an experience of seeing one of these beings, I think, across a lake or something at night, staring at him, and he was scared, obviously, as you would be. And he asked them, where are you from? Where did you come from? And they simply replied, we came from nowhere, which to him meant they must be everywhere. So these beings that are both nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And to me, that sounds like some kind of intelligence that doesn't exist physically in the normal way. And so Max started to think that maybe this alien abduction phenomenon was indeed an interaction with some kind of non-physical intelligence that was both everywhere and nowhere. And he spoke to McKenna. He was interviewed by David J. Brown, who asked him specifically about this, about the connections between the DMT state, and he definitely saw the parallels between the kind of altered state of consciousness that takes you to another world under the influence of DMT, and this apparent altered state of consciousness that takes you behind what he called the theater screen of reality and into this alternate world occupied by these beings. I think there's a lot we can learn from the abduction phenomenon without having to assume that we're talking about these physical wet-bodied beings, but rather something else.
Yeah, man. The phenomenology harmonizes just so troublingly well that for me, as someone who's, taken large amounts of tryptamines and is interested in the UFO topic, I've never had an encounter with an alien being, but in reading so many different experiences, reading books by Valet, reading even your chapter, it's like, man, how do you dismiss the fact that even the entities that are encountered by people in these states, both psychedelic and abducted, are a lot of times described very similarly? Bounding small creatures, of course, the mantids, the reptilians. Rick Strassman told me the first time he broke through on DMT, when Terence McKenna gave it to him, he had a vision of grays, like it was like reality ripped open, and there were gray aliens on the other side of like this rip in reality, just kind of looking at him. And I think he was saying like, "Now do you see? Now do
Now
you
do you
see?" I think he
see?
said that's what they were saying to him, and they were
Yeah.
just looking at him with these like glistening cosmic eyes, and he's just like, I see something. I don't know what I'm supposed to see, but yeah, this like, and then digging deeper into aside from like the surface level imagery in these experiences, the fact that it immediately snaps into this kind of psi communication that doesn't require words. It's just like transmission of thoughts, and you just know how to do it, and you know how to receive it, and you seem to know how to give it back and interact. It's almost as if something is just like a veil is taken off of a faculty that we already have. And I'll kick it over to you before I ramble further, because but I will just add this in is the most recent piece of content I'm working on right now is from Robert Monroe's book Journeys Out of the Body. And there's this chapter in the book that like turns very speculative and very existential. And he posits that in this chapter that there's something unique about the way sentient life evolved on planet Earth. Like we have this psi capacity, just like all these other intelligent entities, but it's like vestigial in us or something, or it's like we don't know that we have it, and we somehow evolved away from it or something like that. And I think that is a plausible argument, because it does seem like it can just suddenly be snapped back on with the right molecular massaging or meditation or who knows what other methods.
So in terms of first of all, in terms of the kind of entities that are encountered, and the similarity in that so many people experience the same types of beings. You said the small, giggling, mischievous, elf-like beings that aren't really elves in the classical sense, as we would see them on a Christmas card or something, but have that jovial quality, but clearly non-human, clearly non-animal. To these insect-like beings, i.e. insectoid, which generally are highly technological, advanced and intelligent, and generally seem more senior, through to reptilians, and then beings that simply defy description. The most common explanation that you hear now is that these are archetypes. In one of the chapters of the book, The Anatomy of a Machine Elf, I break down this idea. The idea that archetypes are quintessentially human structures. These are embedded, inherited patterns that come from our evolutionary past that allow us to respond to and interact with living creatures in the environment in an instinctive way. So they provide us with these very stereotyped patterns of ways of kind of detecting certain types of humans in the environment and certain types of animals, such as snakes, but also all the different types of humans as well. So the way you respond to your mother is different to the way you respond to a stranger, or to a baby, or to an elder within the group with a lot of experience and knowledge, what you might call a wise old man. These are not difficult to explain neurologically, assuming we try and keep our foundation within neuroscience and evolutionary neurobiology. Then the archetypes kind of fall out of the evolution of humans, but they're not. They're nothing more than these inherited instinctive ways of responding to certain types of humans and other animals in the environment. They don't provide imagery. It's one of the great misconceptions that the archetypes are images. They're not images. The archetype, and even Jung never said that the archetypes were images, and he often denied that they were images, as did many of his contemporary commentators. The archetypes can give rise to images generated by the cortex, but these are only images that your brain knows how to construct or has learned how to construct. So if my mother archetype is activated, for example, which is my inherited way of responding to my mother, wanting to be close to my mother, being distressed in the absence of my mother. And these are the inherited patterns, my way of responding to my mother. If that archetype is activated, these subcortical inherited neural patterns of connectivity are activated, then I might see an image of my mother, because it becomes intimately connected to the kind of the world that my brain has learned to construct. But the archetypes, they're not an explanation for machine elves. They're not even an explanation for insectoid beings, although we probably do carry insect archetypes that allow us to detect and respond to insects in the environment. They don't provide the imagery. So the Jungian model, now that we can connect it, because Jung, of course, was operating long before we had this detailed understanding of the neurobiology, we can kind of explain Jungian archetypes with a completely neurological foundation without having to kind of give it carte blanche, give the collective unconscious and the archetypes carte blanche to explain anything. It's in the book I describe the collective unconscious like a magician's hat from which you can pull any type of otherwise inexplicable experiential or psychological phenomena. You can say, oh, that's the collective unconscious. Those are the archetypes. But when you actually dig down and analyze it and deconstruct exactly what the archetypes are, you find that they are very limited in what they can explain. They can explain some types of phenomena, but they can't explain, in my opinion, these highly super intelligent, high technologically advanced, non-human, non-animal beings that have no relationship to humanity at all, either now or any time in our history. So the archetypes really can't help us here. So it remains, in my opinion, very much an open question of why, when you perturb your brain with this simple molecule, you might be able to explain certain types of imagery. You might even be able to explain the induction of a dreamlike state, and even the appearance of other humans or other animals, because that's what the brain naturally tries to do. Is it likes to construct models of humans. It likes to construct models of animals, as it does in the dream state. People dream about dogs and cats if they live in the West. If they live in the Amazon, they dream about snakes. They dream about jaguars, and they dream about fish and piranhas and things, right? Your dream state, the beings you meet in your dreams, the beings your brain wants to construct, tend to be the kind of beings your brain interacts with during normal waking life. So why, when you perturb it with DMT, does it suddenly start, just suddenly start constructing these entirely non-human, non-animal beings that don't communicate with the normal mode of communication that humans have had for a long time, which is speech? Why does it suddenly start constructing beings that only communicate via telepathy, as you said? This is an entirely non-human, apparently, way of communication. So why would it default to that rather than defaulting to simply speaking, as you do in dreams? You speak to people in dreams generally. So yeah, I do think there's certainly something extremely strange going on, something that's not easy to explain going on. I was speaking to what's his name, Andres Emilsson. You know him, the Qualia Research Institute. Andres.
I don't think so.
Yeah, so he did a kind of very popular video called The Hyperbolic Geometry of the DMT Space a few years ago. He's very interested in the mathematics of the DMT space and the kind of the geometric structure and the topological structure, and whether we might try to understand what that means about the nature of the experience. But anyway, he was showing me this cool animation that he'd done, which visualizes on a 2D screen the rotation of a 4-dimensional object. So it contains all the points of a 4-dimensional object, but projected onto a 2D screen. So when you look at it, it's completely inexplicable, or it doesn't make any sense. It just looks like dots moving around. Your brain can't make sense. This is a 4D object. But apparently when you smoke DMT and you look at this object, your brain suddenly recognizes that this is a 4D object and you start seeing it in 4D. I don't know what that experience would be like. I've not tried that experiment, but I'd like to. He said that it feels like when it snaps into this 4D object, it feels like, do you remember that Ram Dass quote where he says that dying is like taking off a tight shoe?
Yes.
It's like you're kind of relaxing into the 4D space. It's like, I'm back. And it feels, he said, it feels very perfectly natural, as if in normal waking life, we're kind of folded and compressed into this three-dimensional form, this three-dimensional structure. Our world is compressed into this three-dimensional form. With DMT, it kind of relaxes out. And there is a sense, certainly, of familiarity and of returning home, as if DMT feels like a homecoming, even though it's fucking bizarre, beyond description. It's still, there's this sense of, I'm back. And they often welcome you back. There's often a party and there's bells ringing and lights flashing and stuff. But yeah, I think going back to your telepathy point there, it does feel overall like the DMT space is intimately connected to us in a way that we simply don't understand.
So what do you think if you think that there's something fundamentally different about dreaming, and that's more explainable, more reducible to the brain, what are your thoughts on whatever is going on with abductees who are on the Natch? Do you think that it could be an endogenous DMT thing? Do you think it could still be some external agency interacting with the brain in a way that makes it feel as though, just that makes it feel alien, I guess. And I, when you were talking about archetypes too, I have so many thoughts, because I think Jung cloaked his true feelings to a degree to seem more academically square for a lot of his career. And then when you read the Red Book and you get into his later writings, it's clear he was like extremely esoteric, very Gnostic adjacent. Somewhere in his collected works, he says the archetypes are the Platonic eidos, like they are the Platonic forms, like they're not just reducible to like he would often say in other writings, like instincts and evolutionary images and whatever that are that have like stained the psyche from time immemorial or whatever. Like I think on some level he was transposing that idea into a realm that he could feel okay about in the daylight, but deeper down he was more of like an idealist, Gnostic, Platonic, alchemical, hermetic thinker, and I think that sort of comes out later. But anyway, I bring that up because I would imagine that you've considered this idea that part of the reason the appearance of the phenomenon is so mercurial a lot of the time and can appear in these ways is because it kind of uses archetypes as masks, and it in the way that it presents itself can change. I mean, this is what people like Valet think, obviously. Obvious to you and I, maybe not obvious to everyone. But yeah, before I continue, the first question about people on the Natch who experience abduction-like experiences, do you think there could be a role DMT has there?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that they are using, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, I'm speculating wildly here.
Yeah.
But I have speculated before that perhaps they might be using potentially DMT, whether you can imagine a being interacting with our neural machinery. And I think that's what's happening here, both with DMT and with the abduction phenomena, is that they're accessing our neural machinery in some way and inducing our brain to construct these models. Because I think when you enter the DMT state, the world you're experiencing is still one that's being represented in the brain, I think, but I just don't think it's being generated spontaneously. And in the book, I describe this as like a directed world. So it's not like not like a sensed world in that you're seeing in the same way that you sense the environment, in that you're kind of receiving information through the sensory organs and using that to inform and modulate and constrain and test this model being constructed by a brain. Nor is it a dreamt world that's completely disconnected from sensory inputs, from external sensory inputs, but more of a directed world, in that the information is being directed into the brain. Some intelligent agent, the nature and origin of which I don't know, is somehow gaining access. And DMT is somehow allowing that intelligence to gain access to your neural machinery and basically to seize control, to commandeer your brain's world-building apparatus to construct these visions. That's how they communicate with us. I don't think that when you see an insectoid alien, it actually has an insectoid form, because it doesn't really make any sense to me that a discarnate being of some sort, assuming that's what it is, I don't think that these insectoids are on another planet and it's simply a communication technology in that way. I don't think you're kind of like a portal to another planet or something. I think what's happening is that they are taking on a form, or as you say, a mask. They are giving themselves a form so that you can recognize them as a being. And sometimes they're quite explicit about this. In one of the trip reports I actually quote in the book, I think, these beings, this girl or guy, I forget which, but anyway, was smoked DMT, and there were these mantis-like beings over him, and he said, are you really mantises? And they said, no, we're not actually mantises, but we appear like this, right? This is just a form we use. And going back to Bernardo Peixoto, he also said, he's coming from a very different worldview, that these beings use form because that's what we understand. We are a creature of visual form. That's how we make sense of the world. So for us to understand their presence and note their presence, that these intelligences are there, they use these forms. And even John Lilly, when he was taking large doses of ketamine and entering this, what he called the extraterrestrial reality, these intelligence within that space also made it clear to him in no uncertain terms that he was constructing the space, and he was constructing their form, so that they could interact with each other. That's what I think links all of these things together. Is you've got this machine in our heads, this world building machine, and sometimes it can be hacked under certain circumstances. I don't think that always requires DMT at all, but I think DMT is the most efficient tool that we have to instantaneously generate this very fluid and malleable and perturbable neural state that allows these intelligences to gain access and take control and use our brain to construct their world. And just before I finish, I will just mention there was a paper published by the Imperial College research team just in the last few weeks that actually demonstrated this neurological state in DMT. So you have, I forget what the title of the paper was, but it basically showed that in the presence of DMT, the brain enters this state where it becomes much more sensitive to external perturbations. So you stimulate the brain in some way, whether it's through visual sensory information or other means, or electrically or whatever, and it responds much more strongly. The neural activity can be manipulated much more easily in the DMT state. And so this is precisely the kind of state that I was proposing existed in the presence of DMT, and which is in the book. But unfortunately, the paper wasn't in the book because it came out a couple of months too late. But it's nice to see that these, what to many would seem like wild speculations on my part, seem to be borne out to some extent, at least, by the neuroscience, which is showing this kind of highly sensitive malleable state of the brain that these beings can access, whether using DMT or through other means, maybe even during the dream state, when the brain isn't being polluted, so to speak, by sensory inputs, or in a deep ketamine state in a sensory isolation chamber, or many other states potentially can allow these intelligences, these intelligent agents, to gain access.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. This is about the time in the podcast that all the evangelical Christians start writing demons in the comments. But two things I want to linger on Lilly, because there's an interesting connection to him and Valet I never thought about until just now. But two, before we go away from the neuroscience, one of the things that I've struggled to understand as a layperson that I should ask you is that there seems to be, like, from the articles I've read, the brain under the influence of tryptamines seems to go into this more entropic state where a lot of the usual network clusters are not firing like they normally do. And that's led a lot of people to, make the assumption that, look, maybe, it's clearly, if the brain was hallucinating, you'd be seeing the brain going crazy with all kinds of activity. That's not what we see. So first, is DMT the same in that respect as other tryptamines, or is what happens in the brain on a DMT trip different?
It's similar in some ways, but then in other ways it's very different. I mean, experientially, clearly it's very different. So how do we reconcile the differences? So when kind of in broad terms, when a tryptamine psychedelic or other types of psychedelics enter the brain, they stimulate certain populations of neurons by binding to these particular receptors. They make the neurons more sensitive, more excitable. They allow information to start flowing between certain areas of the brain much more easily. And so overall, the brain enters this, as I said, this more fluid and dynamic state. When you observe that in an MRI machine, for example, you will see this highly structured and highly ordered patterns of neural activity start to break down. And the neural activity becomes more fluid and dynamic and effectively more apparently random. And this is where the whole entropic brain, Robin Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis came from. And that kind of makes sense. And it's to some extent explains many of the effects of psychedelics. This loosening up of the world itself that you experience often becomes more fluid and dynamic, less stable, less predictable. Objects seem to lose their identity or morph. The brain is basically losing control over its world model. And so you go from this state of order to this state of disorder. The brain is nudged towards the chaotic realm. So Carhart-Harris describes it as a nudge towards criticality. So that you have this, the brain is always trying to strike this balance between order and disorder, what we call the edge of chaos, which is where complexity arises. Wow. And too ordered, and information just simply can't be processed, right? The world becomes perfectly stable and sort of crystallized, and that's not useful. If you want a world that's kind of keeping up with all of the dynamic processes unfolding in the environment, you want a world that can respond to and rapidly change in response to sensory inputs. So it can't be too stable. At the same time, if it's too unstable, then the world just becomes completely fluid and dynamic and doesn't function as a model of the environment anymore. So you need to strike that balance. And the brain does that very well by tuning the strength of the connections between its neurons, as well as tuning the excitability of individual neurons. What psychedelics do is they nudge the brain towards the chaotic realm, but not into the chaotic realm, towards this point of criticality, as it's called, where you lose order and kind of are tossed into the chaotic realm. And so you go from order to disorder. Now, that shift towards disorder explains many of the effects of psychedelics. as I said, this more disordered world. It seems to match the experience of people under the influence of psychedelics. But with DMT, something stranger seems to happen. It seems to transcend that. You go from order to disorder, but then you collapse into an entirely new order, which is this alternate world model. The DMT world is not disordered. It's not entropic. It is highly ordered. It is highly coherent. It has massive structural, dynamic, and narrative complexity that is, bewildering and baffling and confounding all at the same time, and awe-inspiring. So that I think is something that is very difficult to explain. It's like the brain has found a new channel. Other psychedelics at normal doses tend to kind of nudge the dial out of tune, perhaps. But with DMT, it's like finding a new channel on the TV set, but then discovering that the antenna has been disconnected. And you're like, where did this channel come from? Why does the brain know how to construct these entirely non-human alien realities filled with these intelligent beings that have no relationship to the normal waking world that you've left behind? So I think, but there are, going back to the neuroscience, the neuroimaging, there are some very tantalizing results, not just this most recent study that I just described, but in a study a few years ago, they actually measured the flow of electrical activity through the brain, the flow of these waves. You have these, when sensory information through the eyes enters the brain, it enters the brain through the back, and you have these what are called forward flowing waves, which represent, in predictive processing terms, we don't have to go into, they represent these error signals flowing up the cortex from the lowest levels at the back of the brain towards the higher levels. And then you experience, you can also measure waves flowing in the opposite direction. So there's this balance of waves. When you have your eyes open, the signal is dominated by waves flowing from the back to the front. So this flow of sensory information into the brain, basically. And way back in, I say way back, but what kind of way back now, in the 90s, Jordi Reba, Jordi Reba, who sadly passed away, but he was one of the most prominent ayahuasca researchers. And he noticed that when he put an EEG headset on his subjects and gave them ayahuasca, even when their eyes were closed, he noticed that there was a stronger influence of the electrodes at the back of the brain over those at the front, again suggesting that information was flowing, even though they had their eyes closed. Information was flowing from the lower sensory cortices, in the normal way, as if they were viewing some other world. And the Imperial College team, quite a few years later, did much more sophisticated EEG experiments and actually showed that the closed eye DMT state was effectively indistinguishable from the normal open eyes waking state. Suggesting, they could see the information flowing from the back of the brain, right? And the question is, why? First of all, why is the brain apparently processing sensory information even though the eyes are closed? Of course, in Reba's paper and others, they say, oh, this is noise. This is spontaneous activity emerging from the lower sensory cortices. My response to that is, wait a minute. This clearly isn't spontaneous activity of the lower sensory cortices. We can use that to explain, form constants, going back to Heinrich Kluwer, cobwebs or geometric patterns. That kind of thing can be explained by spontaneous activity of the lower sensory cortices, but not complex alien realities filled with strange beings. So that doesn't make any sense. Cortical noise just seemed like a silly explanation, but of course that's the best they had. They couldn't say, or maybe this is sensory information from some intelligent alien intelligence, or something like that. So, but that to me, that seems again like more evidence that we're not seeing dreams, we're not seeing hallucinations, we're not seeing memories. That sometimes happens when the brain, the cortex becomes more fluid and dynamic. It actually starts to lose control over information flowing from the temporal lobes, and so you get the flood of memories. You get these kind of reliving of past experiences that people often have been describing for decades under high doses of LSD, for example, where people relive past experiences, going back to their childhood, for example. That can be explained. Simply the brain is losing control of the flow of information from these hippocampal temporal lobe memory systems, but that doesn't explain it either. That certainly doesn't explain the DMT state. So again, the question is, where is this information coming from to construct these entirely alien worlds?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's impossible for me as someone who's uh, deeply fascinated with Platonism and really mystical traditions the world over. Nearly all of them talk about a kind of like soul sense or eye of the soul. And I don't even want to say one of the few times I'll say third eye in a non-tongue-in-cheek way. Anybody
The
who's
name of your
had
podcast.
I know, man. I have a major love hate with it. Um, I had never really had any kind of majorly impactful literal third eye experience until I went to Peru and did ayahuasca. And on my most impactful night of those 5 sessions, I kept literally for the only time in my life this has ever happened. I mean, I was having insanely vivid mind's eye visuals, and this was the only night that I wasn't in some kind of like lower astral hell realm of just, deep torment. Like every night was really, really challenging. But then the third night I broke through to this much more luminous, intelligent, in presence of something that felt like it was giving me like the teaching, kind of guru presence. And during that period of time, Andrew, the only time in my life this has ever happened, I kept feeling like there was something on my head, like right in the center of my head. And I kept brushing it away, like, what is on my head? And then I started laughing to myself. I'm like, is this the fucking third eye? Like, is this what this is? And you saying that, that this study, this neuroimaging study on ayahuasca has very sight-like behaviors in the brain, like that's very interesting. And I mean, I would assume that this is the same with a significant dose of any tryptamine, or do we not know that? Or would you assume that based on the similarities? Because I mean, when you're having these vivid mind's eye, inner eye, other eye experiences, it is kind of like you're seeing stuff, but it's also different. It's the phenomenology is like the closest thing you can say is I saw it, but it's also not exactly like seeing it with your physical eyes.
Yeah, I think firstly, I think with other tryptamines, I don't think we know. I don't think experiments have been done that this particular looking at these traveling waves that's been done with DMT. I'd like to see it being done with other tryptamines. I'd hope that you don't see it. That would be really cool.
Oh, really?
If you did, well, it would. I mean, because that would there would be like incontrovertible evidence that DMT was doing something very different. If you didn't see this flow of activity from the lower sensory cortices under, psilocybin, for example, at a normal dose, or LSD. But I expect you might. Because I do expect that you do get spontaneous activity in the lower sensory cortices. And we know, as I said, mentioned Heinrich Kluver, who developed these form constants back in the middle of the early 20th century now. This was all done with mescaline. We know that when you stimulate the cortex or when you release the lower sensory cortices, that you do get these spontaneous patterns emerging. And so I expect you'd see some kind of flow of information from the back. But whether it's much stronger with DMT, I don't know. But clearly this isn't just form constants. But yes, it clearly is. Like seeing with your eyes shut, and you're observing. It's often described with DMT that it's not like a drug; it's more like an observation. It feels more like a technology.
Ooh, yeah.
That you've simply your reality channel has been switched to another channel, and you're observing this world that's been going on before you arrived and will continue to do so long after you've left, and may well have been going on for trillions of years before our universe popped into existence, right?